In Thunder Creek, Montana, 7 members of the Thunder Legion Motorcycle Club thought they found an easy target, a disabled veteran in a wheelchair at a local gas station. What they didn't know was that Michael Iron Mike Reynolds wasn't just any veteran. He was a former Navy SEAL turned Marine Corps officer now working as an undercover FBI operative investigating their weapons trafficking operation. In just 30 seconds, 4 bikers hit the ground, 2 lost consciousness, and their leader found himself staring down the barrel of his own gun. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. At the Walker family farm, life moved at a steady pace, following the natural rhythms of planting and harvest. Sarah Walker, 23, had grown up here, learning every inch of the 200 acres her father had bought after retiring from the military. The small produce stand by Route 12 was her pride, a way to share their organic vegetables with the community while saving money for graduate school. Her father, Thomas, worked the backfields, preferring solitude and hard physical labor. Most locals knew him only as the quiet farmer who kept to himself, always polite, but somehow distant. None of them knew about his classified missions across 4 continents, or the Medal of Honor quietly gathering dust in his desk drawer. Even Sarah only knew pieces of his past, understanding there were parts of her father's life he couldn't, or wouldn't, talk about. As the late summer sun beat down on another quiet afternoon, Sarah arranged fresh tomatoes at the stand while keeping one eye on the distant dust cloud approaching from the east. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder, and something in that sound sent a shiver of unease down her spine. She reached for her phone, remembering her father's constant instruction. Trust your instincts. The first 3 bikes roared past, then circled back. 3 more pulled up directly in front of the stand, cutting off any easy escape route. Their leather cuts displayed the Crimson Rider's insignia, a skull wrapped in blazing chains. Sarah had heard rumors about the gang's growing presence in the county, but they'd always kept to the other side of the valley. Until now. Well, what do we have here? The largest rider dismounted, removing mirrored sunglasses to reveal cold eyes. Prettiest produce stand I've ever seen. His smile didn't reach those eyes as he moved closer. Name's Snake. My boys and I are mighty hungry after a long ride. Sarah maintained her composure, years of her father's teachings kicking in automatically. Observe, assess, plan. We've got plenty of fresh vegetables, cash only. Her voice stayed steady, betraying none of the tension coiling in her stomach. Snake laughed, a harsh sound that his companions echoed. Oh, we're not really here for vegetables, sweetheart. He picked up a tomato, squeezing until it burst. Word is this little farm of yours sits on some mighty valuable property. Been telling your daddy he should sell? In the back field, Thomas Walker straightened from where he'd been checking irrigation lines. 27 years of combat instincts never really faded. They just shifted focus. The distant sound of motorcycles had registered immediately, but it was the silence that followed that set off warning bells. No engine noise, no usual chatter from Sarah's produce stand, just the kind of quiet that, in his experience, usually preceded trouble. He moved with practiced efficiency, each step purposeful but unhurried. To anyone watching, he would have looked like any farmer heading in from the fields. They wouldn't notice how his movements eliminated any sound, how his path kept him concealed by the corn rows, or how his eyes constantly scanned for tactical advantage. Sarah's voice carried across the yard, tighter than normal but controlled. This farm isn't for sale, never will be. Everything's for sale, darling. Snake's voice hardened. Just depends on the motivation. Maybe we need to help you convince Daddy to reconsider his options. Thomas reached the barn's shadow, assessing the situation with cold precision. 6 hostels, 3 blocking the road, 3 closer to the stand, multiple weapons visible. Sarah positioned defensively, exactly as he'd trained her. Main threat, large male approximately 8 feet from her, others spread in standard intimidation formation. Last chance to leave quietly, Sarah stated firmly, though her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. Snake's arm shot out, knocking the phone from her grip. No one's going anywhere until we have a proper conversation about real estate. He grabbed Sarah's wrist, yanking her forward. Maybe we should continue this discussion somewhere more private. The next few seconds would remain forever etched in Sarah's memory. One moment, Snake's fingers were clenched around her wrist, his face twisted in a cruel smile. The next, a shadow seemed to materialize from nowhere. Snake's grip vanished as he was wrenched backward, a startled cry cut short by precise impact that dropped him to his knees. Her father stood there, not the quiet farmer she was used to seeing, but something else entirely. His stance was perfectly balanced, movements liquid smooth as two more riders rushed him. She'd never seen him move like this, never imagined the lethal grace hidden beneath his usual calm demeanor. The confrontation was about to explode into violence that would change everything, not just for the Walker family, but for an entire state caught in the grip of corruption. But in that frozen moment, as Thomas Ghost Walker prepared to remind the world why he'd earned his call sign, Sarah finally understood what her father had been trying to teach her all along. Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that never needed to show its teeth. What happened next unfolded with surgical precision. The first biker charged, telegraphing a wild haymaker that Thomas deflected with practiced ease. His counter-strike found the nerve cluster at the base of the skull, a technique perfected in countless close-quarter engagements. The man dropped without a sound. The second and third attackers came simultaneously, coordinating their assault with the practiced timing of men used to overwhelming opponents through sheer force. Thomas moved like water between them, his movements economical and precise. A short strike to the throat silenced one's warning shout. An arm lock transition flowing into a throw sent the other crashing into the produce stand. "He's just one old farmer," Snake bellowed, struggling to his feet. "Take him down." The remaining riders drew weapons, crude but effective improvised clubs and brass knuckles. Thomas assessed and adapted instantly, just as he had in countless combat situations. The weighted chain that whistled past his head found only empty air. His response was devastating, a precise strike to the wielder's elbow that produced an audible crack. Sarah watched in astonishment as her quiet, unassuming father systematically dismantled men half his age. Every movement served multiple purposes. Each defense created openings for attack. Each position denied his opponent stable footing or clear targets. This wasn't just fighting. This was combat mathematics, angles and leverage applied with lethal efficiency. The fifth rider managed to land a glancing blow to Thomas's ribs, a success that proved short-lived. Thomas trapped the offending arm, using his opponent's momentum to send him careening into Snake, who was attempting to flank. Both men went down hard. "Last chance." Thomas's voice carried the kind of authority that could only be earned through decades of command. "Stay down, or things get serious." Snake's response was to pull a concealed handgun. His hand never reached the grip. Thomas closed the distance with explosive speed, fingers finding pressure points that sent waves of paralyzing pain through Snake's arm. The gun clattered uselessly to the dirt. "That was a mistake," Thomas said quietly, maintaining the disabling hold. "Now we're going to have a very different conversation." The remaining conscious riders stayed down, their bravado evaporated in the face of overwhelming skill. Sarah kept her phone ready, recording everything just as her father had always taught her. Document, preserve evidence, create witnesses. "Listen carefully," Thomas addressed Snake, his voice carrying the same calm tone he used when discussing crop rotation. "You're going to tell me exactly who sent you. This isn't about real estate. You're not real estate scouts, and we both know it. So let's start with the truth." Snake's defiance crumbled under increasing pressure. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, old man. This goes way higher than you know. Try me." Thomas adjusted his grip slightly, causing Snake to gasp. 27 years in Delta Force taught me a lot about how high things can go. "Start talking." The color drained from Snake's face at the mention of Delta Force. His next words came out in a rush. "State Commissioner Rogers. He's the one who wants the land. Says it's perfect for some kind of agricultural development project. We were just supposed to persuade you to sell. And if persuasion didn't work?" Snake's silence was answer enough. Thomas's voice hardened. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get on your bike, assuming you can still ride, and deliver a message. Tell Rogers that Thomas Walker sends his regards. Tell him I know exactly what kind of agricultural development he's planning. And tell him that if he wants my land, he should come himself instead of sending amateur thugs to threaten my daughter. He released the hold, stepping back with the same fluid grace he'd shown throughout the confrontation. Snake stumbled to his feet, helping his dazed companions onto their bikes. Their departure left clouds of dust and wounded pride in equal measure. Sarah approached her father, seeing him in an entirely new light. Dad. That was. Training never really leaves you, Thomas replied simply, already checking her for any injuries. Are you all right? I'm fine. But what did you mean about knowing what Rogers is planning? What kind of agricultural development needs motorcycle gang intimidation? Thomas surveyed the scattered produce and overturned stands with a tactical eye. The kind that has nothing to do with agriculture. Those weren't just random bikers, Sarah. Their technique, their weapons, their enforcers. And a state commissioner using gang members as proxies means something bigger is happening. What do? First, we clean up and document everything. Then I need to make some calls, reactivate old contacts. Rogers crossed a line bringing this to our home, threatening you. Now he gets to learn why some of us never really retire. As they restored order to the produce stand, neither Walker suspected how far the corruption reached, or how their quiet farm had just become ground zero in a conflict that would expose decades of hidden crimes. The Crimson Riders were about to learn a painful lesson about underestimating quiet farmers, and Commissioner Rogers was about to be reminded why some reputations are earned in blood. Inside the Walker farmhouse, Thomas methodically cleaned and checked his old combat knife while Sarah reviewed the video footage on her laptop. Years of habit had him positioned with clear sight lines to all approaches, his movements precise and economical as he worked. 4 different angles, Sarah reported, fingers flying across the keyboard. Clear footage of them making threats and attacking first. I've got backups uploading to secure servers. Thomas nodded approvingly. She'd learned well. Documentation could be as powerful as any weapon. Any clear shots of their patches? Identifying marks? Better. Their leader, Snake. His real name is Marcus Hawkins. 3 priors for assault, suspected ties to drug trafficking, but nothing ever stuck, and look at this. She turned the screen showing police reports. Every case mysteriously disappeared right before trial. Thomas absorbed the information, adding it to his mental tactical map. Protection from somewhere high up. Rogers clearing the way for his enforcers. His phone buzzed. A number he hadn't seen in years. Walker, he answered, voice shifting subtly to a command tone. Ghost. The voice belonged to James Martinez, now working in state law enforcement intelligence. Just got interesting chatter. Your little farm stand throwdown has people nervous in high places. Rogers made 3 calls right after it happened. 2 to unlisted numbers. 1 to a law firm known for representing the Crimson Riders. What kind of agricultural development needs that kind of legal coverage? That's the thing, Martinez continued. I did some digging. Rogers has approved 6 agricultural development projects in the last year. Each one required specific land purchases. Each property sat along major transit routes, and each sale happened after incidents of vandalism or threats convinced owners to sell cheap. Thomas's expression hardened. Money laundering and distribution networks disguised as farming operations. The legitimate business provides cover while the land itself creates perfect smuggling corridors. Gets worse. Those unlisted numbers Rogers called? One traces back to shell companies linked to international drug cartels. The other... Martinez paused. Ghost. It came from inside the governor's mansion. Sarah, listening intently, saw her father's posture shift subtly, the farmer disappearing completely as the Delta operator emerged. How deep does this go, Jim? Deep enough that I shouldn't be making this call. But you saved my life in Kandahar. I owed you this warning. They're not going to let this go, especially not after you embarrassed their muscle. Watch your 6. The call ended. Thomas stood, moving to the gun safe concealed behind a false panel. Sarah. I need you to go stay with your aunt in Idaho. I'm not leaving you to handle this alone. This isn't a debate. If Rogers is connected to cartels and has protection from the governor's office, they're going to. Headlights swept across the windows. Multiple vehicles approaching fast. Back door, Thomas commanded. Server room. Now. They moved swiftly to the reinforced basement room Thomas had insisted on building, officially for Sarah's web design business. The real reason became clear as he activated systems that would have seemed out of place on a simple farm: military-grade surveillance, communications equipment, and a weapons cache that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew the quiet farmer. Local sheriff's vehicles, Sarah reported, watching camera feeds. But those aren't regular deputies. Thomas recognized the tactical stance of the men emerging from the cars. Private contractors. Rogers isn't wasting time. He handed Sarah a secure satellite phone. Emergency protocols, just like we practiced. If anything happens, Thomas Walker. A voice boomed through a megaphone. This is Sheriff Davies. We have reports of assault and battery at your produce stand. Come out with your hands visible. 4-man teams, Thomas observed, watching their deployment. Standard breach formation. They're not here to make arrests. Sarah's fingers flew across keyboards, archiving video footage to offshore servers. They're trying to scrub evidence before it goes public. Dad, what you said about Rogers' properties, I think it's bigger than drugs. Look at these shipping manifests I found. Thomas scanned the documents, years of experience letting him spot the patterns. Agricultural equipment imports that didn't match any actual farming needs, weight discrepancies in cargo that made no sense for produce shipments, and buried in the data, references to something called Project Harvest Moon. This isn't just about drug routes, he realized. They're moving something else, something that needed very specific properties along very specific transit lines. Boots on the porch, glass breaking upstairs. Time to move, Thomas decided. Emergency exit 3. Have your bug-out bag? Sarah nodded, already retrieving the pre-packed gear they'd rehearsed with but never expected to use. They're going to try to frame you for assaulting those bikers, make you look like the aggressor. That's assuming they plan to let either of us tell any story at all. Thomas's voice was grimly certain. Right now we know too much, which means we've got about 30 seconds before. The power cut out, plunging the farmhouse into darkness. But Thomas Walker had spent decades operating in shadows far darker than these. What Commissioner Rogers and his men were about to learn was that sometimes darkness favors the hunter more than the prey. The farmhouse darkness felt alive with tension as Thomas led Sarah through carefully prepared escape routes. His mind processed tactical data automatically. 12 hostiles total, standard private military contractor loadout, trying to project legitimate law enforcement presence while positioning for something far more lethal. Ghostwalker. Sheriff Davis's voice carried false professional concern. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Those bikers are pressing charges. We just need your statement. Thomas's response was silence as he and Sarah moved through hidden passages he'd built into the walls years ago. Every apparent architectural quirk of the old farmhouse concealed a tactical advantage. Clear lines of fire, covered evacuation routes, pre-positioned equipment caches. Multiple targets converging on the east wing, Sarah whispered, watching their modified security feeds through a tablet. Her father had trained her well, voice steady, movements precise, fear controlled and channeled into focused action. They reached the tunnel entrance behind the root cellar, just as the first flashlight beams cut through upper windows. Thomas activated the biometric lock, revealing a passage that would take them to an exit point half a mile away. Standard search patterns would miss it completely. Sir, one of the tactical team members reported, voice carrying through their surveillance. No signs of targets, but you need to see this. Hidden room full of surveillance equipment, weapons cache, communications gear. This isn't just some farmer. Of course it's not, a new voice responded, smooth, educated, carrying authority. Commissioner Rogers warned us. Walker's former Delta Force, high-level operator, extremely dangerous, which is why we need to contain this situation immediately. Sarah's tablet showed the speaker, expensive suit, executive bearing, moving with the confidence of someone used to command. Dad, that's Jacob Prescott. He's Rogers' chief of staff. Thomas's expression hardened. State official running tactical teams, coordinating with private military contractors. This goes higher than we thought. He checked his watch. Contingency protocols activated 12 minutes ago. Data's already streaming to secure locations. They moved swiftly through the tunnel, decades of muscle memory making every movement silent and efficient. Behind them, boots thundered through the farmhouse as teams executed their search with professional precision. But they were searching for targets that had already anticipated their every move. Ground floor clear. Voices echoed through their surveillance feeds, moving to basement level. Be advised, Prescott's command carried urgency now. Priority is securing any surveillance equipment, documents, or digital storage. Walker's been gathering evidence. Nothing leaves this property without my direct approval. Sarah and Thomas reached the tunnel's midpoint, where emergency gear waited in waterproof containers. They moved with practiced efficiency, donning tactical vests and checking weapons. This cache, like everything else, had been prepared years ago. Thomas Walker believed in planning for every contingency. You knew something like this might happen, Sarah realized, watching her father check sightlines and escape routes with automatic precision. All the preparations, the training, the hidden equipment, you were getting ready for this. Not this specifically, Thomas replied, his voice carrying the calm focus she recognized from their practice drills. But people like me, we see patterns. Rogers's land grabs, the cartel connections, the government protection. It all fits something I've seen before. The question is what they're really moving through those properties. Sarah's tablet beeped, a warning from their surveillance system. They've found the server room. They're trying to access the local drives. Let them. Thomas allowed himself a grim smile. Those drives are decoys. The real data's already spreading through networks they can't track. By morning, every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the country will have copies. The tablet showed Prescott's growing frustration as his tech team reported their findings. Sir, the drives are empty. Just farming records and website data, but there's evidence of massive data transfers within the last hour. Find it! Prescott's polished exterior cracked. Rogers was clear. Nothing from Walker's surveillance can go public. The entire operation depends on... He caught himself, but not before revealing more than intended. Operation, Thomas repeated thoughtfully. Not project, not business. Military terminology from a state official. Sarah, cross-reference those shipping manifests with military supply chains. Look for patterns in weight discrepancies, routing anomalies. Sarah's fingers flew across the tablet while Thomas maintained security. The tunnel felt deeper underground than ever, but years of training kept claustrophobia at bay. Focus on the mission. Process the data. Find the pattern. Got something, she whispered. The equipment manifests. They match supply requests from private military contractors operating in conflict zones, but the weights are all wrong for agricultural machinery. Thomas's expression turned grimmer. They're not just moving drugs. They're using agricultural shipments to hide weapons trafficking. The cartels are just cover for something bigger. A new alert flashed on Sarah's tablet. Dad, they've found the tunnel entrance, and... She hesitated, reading the incoming data. We've got multiple vehicles approaching from the county line. Heavy transport trucks with military escort. Thomas checked his watch again, mental calculations running automatically. They're not just here to silence us. This was planned. The assault at the produce stand, the sheriff's response. It was all timed to clear the property tonight. Something's being moved through here, something big enough to need this level of security theater. The tunnel vibrated slightly as heavy vehicles moved overhead. Whatever Operation Harvest Moon really was, its next phase was starting. But Thomas Walker had spent a career spoiling other people's carefully laid plans. Now he just had to figure out how to do it one more time. The transport trucks rumbled overhead as Thomas and Sarah reached the tunnel's emergency exit point, a maintenance shed on adjacent property Thomas had purchased through shell companies years ago. His Delta Force experience had taught him the value of having multiple fallback positions and untraceable assets. 3 military-grade transports, Sarah reported, checking drone feeds on her tablet. Professional escort teams, communications gear that definitely isn't standard law enforcement issue. They're setting up a perimeter around the farm. Thomas moved with practiced efficiency, activating systems that would cover their exit. Those trucks aren't here for evidence collection. They're using this whole incident as cover for something else. He checked his encrypted phone. Martinez is sending updated satellite data. Whatever they're moving, they needed this specific route at this specific time. The shed's security feeds showed Prescott coordinating with new arrivals, men whose bearings screamed special operations background. Not contractors this time. These were the real professionals. "Sir," one reported to Prescott, "advance teams confirm the property is clear. No signs of Walker or his daughter, but they couldn't have gone far. Local units are setting up roadblocks." Prescott's response was terse. "Find them." The commissioner was clear. Nothing can interfere with tonight's shipment, especially not some retired operator playing farmer. Sarah's tablet pinged with incoming data. "Dad, look at this. I cross-referenced those shipping manifests with military supply databases. The weight discrepancies, they're not just concealing weapons. The numbers match experimental military hardware, prototype systems that officially don't exist." Thomas processed this information, decades of experience letting him see the larger pattern. Rogers isn't just running weapons. He's selling classified military technology through his agricultural network. The cartels are just cover for something much bigger. A new alert flashed on Sarah's screen. Multiple vehicles approaching from the north, different signatures than the others. These look like private security. Thomas finished, recognizing the formation. High-end personal protection details. Someone important is coming to observe. Through their surveillance, they watched a black SUV convoy approach the farm. The central vehicle's windows were darkened, but Thomas noted how the escort teams positioned themselves. This wasn't just another state official. "Governor Harrison," Sarah breathed, recognizing the figure who emerged. "He's supposed to be at a fundraiser in the capital. Instead, he's here, personally overseeing what's supposed to be a simple police response to a farm dispute." Thomas's voice carried grim certainty. "This goes higher than Rogers. The whole state government is compromised." The governor spoke briefly with Prescott, their words too low for surveillance to catch. But their body language told Thomas everything he needed to know. This wasn't a superior checking on an operation. This was a partner ensuring his investment was secure. The distribution network, Sarah realized, putting pieces together. All those agricultural properties Rogers forced people to sell. They're not just transit points, they're creating an entire shadow infrastructure. Thomas nodded. Using legitimate business cover to move classified technology right through official channels. Anyone investigating just sees normal agricultural shipments moving through normal transportation routes. A burst of encrypted communication caught their attention. Sarah decoded it quickly. Her father had insisted she learn military-grade cryptography. They're starting the transfer. Whatever's in those trucks, they're moving it into the barn. Thomas studied the operation with professional appreciation. The teams moved with practiced efficiency, maintaining perfect security coverage while transferring large crates from the trucks. Everything looked legitimate to any casual observer, just normal farm activity, albeit late at night. "We need to see what's in those crates," Sarah said. "Agreed. But they'll be expecting that. They know my background. They'll have prepared for standard infiltration tactics." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "Fortunately, I learned a few things after Delta Force." He moved to one of his hidden caches, retrieving specialized equipment that would have seemed out of place on a farm. Rogers and his people think they understand all the angles because they've got military and intelligence experience. That's their weakness. "What do you mean?" "They're thinking like operators, looking for tactical approaches they'd use. But I've spent the last 5 years thinking like a farmer." He held up what looked like normal agricultural monitoring equipment. Sometimes the best way to gather intelligence isn't with military gear. Sarah understood immediately. The soil sensors, the ones we use to monitor crop conditions, are actually sophisticated surveillance devices that look exactly like normal farm equipment. We've got hundreds of them planted across the property. No one thinks twice about agricultural monitors on a farm. Through these hidden sensors, they began gathering data on whatever was being moved into their barn. But more importantly, they were proving something Thomas had learned through decades of operations. Sometimes the most effective approach isn't the most obvious one. The governor and his security team departed as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving Prescott to oversee the operation. But Thomas Walker had already set in motion plans that would ensure this night ended very differently than they expected. Official story is that they're monitoring a potential gang-related disturbance. Roger's making sure no legitimate law enforcement interferes, Thomas nodded, which means we're on our own. Sarah's fingers flew across her tablet, coordinating data streams. Not entirely alone. Those data packets we uploaded, they're starting to hit major news outlets. Within an hour, this whole operation will be exposed. Then we don't need to win, Thomas said, making final preparations. We just need to survive long enough for the story to break. Keep them contained, keep them focused here, and let their own operation become their trap. The sun had fully set now, casting the farm in darkness, broken only by tactical teams' lights as they secured the property. But Thomas Walker had spent decades learning that darkness favors those who know how to use it. Prescott's men were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one you're trained to fight against. It's the one you never even think to look for. Thomas activated the first phase of his improvised defense system with a simple command on his tablet. Across the farm, irrigation pipes that appeared normal from the outside began executing carefully planned protocols. Fine mists of specially treated water created zones of reduced visibility, while modified sprinkler heads redirected thermal signatures. Their night vision equipment is top-tier military grade, Sarah noted, monitoring security feeds. But they're calibrated for standard tactical conditions. Not agricultural ones, Thomas confirmed. Water vapor at specific densities plays havoc with thermal imaging. Add the mineral content from our fertilizer storage, and their expensive equipment becomes nearly useless. Prescott's voice carried clear frustration through their surveillance. Something's wrong with the imaging systems. Recalibrate and sweep again. Walker's here somewhere. Find him. Teams moved with professional precision, but their movements showed growing uncertainty. Every standard tactical approach was being subtly disrupted by seemingly natural farm conditions. Ground that should have been firm became mysteriously slick, clear lines of sight filled with drifting mists that their equipment couldn't quite penetrate. "Sir," one operator reported, "we're getting weird readings from the soil, some kind of chemical reaction affecting our ground radar." "It's a farm," Prescott snapped. "There are chemicals everywhere. Focus on finding Walker before—" A series of explosions lit up the night, but not the kind anyone expected. Across the property, storage tanks marked as containing routine agricultural chemicals began venting clouds of colored smoke. Each cloud was harmless but specifically designed to interfere with different types of tactical equipment. "What the hell is this?" Prescott demanded, as his team's communications began experiencing interference. "Mineral compounds," Thomas explained quietly to Sarah as they monitored the chaos. "Common farming chemicals that, when combined properly, create electromagnetic disruption. Nothing lethal, nothing illegal. Just normal agricultural supplies used very, very precisely." Sarah's tablet showed enemy teams struggling to maintain coordination as their high-tech gear encountered problems it was never designed to handle. "They're splitting into smaller units, trying to maintain visual contact, just like you predicted." Thomas nodded grimly. "Standard tactical response when communications are compromised, which means—" He activated the second phase. Irrigation systems that had been spreading treated water suddenly reversed flow, creating patches of ground that looked solid, but couldn't support weight. 3 operators went down hard, their expensive gear useless against basic physics and carefully prepared soil composition. "This is impossible," they heard Prescott rage through deteriorating communications. "He's one man. How is he doing this?" "Because they're thinking like soldiers," Thomas explained, making minute adjustments to his systems. "Looking for weapons, explosives, tactical equipment. Nobody suspects the irrigation pipes, the fertilizer tanks, the normal farm equipment they've been walking past all night. Sarah's tablet flashed new warnings. Dad, they're bringing in heavy equipment, trying to move their cargo out before whatever you're planning happens. The barn's hidden basement had been emptied, crates of classified technology loaded back onto trucks. But Thomas had anticipated this too. With another command, underground irrigation pipes that seemed to be part of normal water management systems revealed their true purpose. Pressurized water, mixed with specific agricultural chemicals, began creating sinkholes in carefully prepared locations, not large enough to be dangerous, but perfectly placed to disable vehicles. "Sir!" a driver's panicked voice. "The ground's giving way under the trucks. We can't move the cargo." Prescott's response was cut off as another of Thomas's defensive measures activated. The farm's grain silos, which appeared normal from the outside, began venting massive clouds of specialized chaff, particles that played havoc with radio communications and electronic systems. "They're not going anywhere," Thomas said with quiet satisfaction. "Every route off this property has been prepared. 5 years of planning, hiding defensive measures disguised as normal agricultural infrastructure. Because sometimes the best security isn't about having bigger weapons. It's about understanding your environment." Sarah monitored their surveillance as Prescott's well-trained teams began showing signs of genuine fear. Nothing in their tactical experience had prepared them for this kind of asymmetric resistance. Every piece of high-tech military equipment they relied on was being systematically neutralized by seemingly natural farm conditions. Thermal imaging completely useless, an operator reported. Ground radar showing false readings everywhere. Radio communications degraded to almost nothing. "Keep it together," Prescott ordered, but his voice carried an edge of panic. "Walker's out here somewhere. He has to be physically triggering these effects. Find him." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "That's their final mistake. They still think this is a tactical engagement. They haven't realized that every piece of this farm was designed for exactly this scenario. We're not fighting them. The entire property is." Through their surveillance, they watched as the professional tactical teams devolved into increasingly desperate searches, looking for an opponent who wasn't using any of the methods they'd trained to counter. Because Thomas Walker had learned that sometimes the most effective defense isn't about matching force with force. It's about turning your enemy's assumptions into weapons against them. "Multiple vehicles approaching fast," Sarah reported, checking traffic cameras on surrounding roads. "News vans. Looks like those data packets we uploaded are getting attention. Local stations first, but I'm seeing network logos too." Thomas watched Prescott's reaction through their surveillance. The man's polished exterior had cracked completely as he realized his operation was about to be exposed. "Get those trucks moving," he shouted. "I don't care what it takes. Nothing stays on this property." "Sir," one of his tactical commanders responded, "the ground's too unstable. Equipment's not responding. We need heavy recovery vehicles just to—" "Then call them in. Call in everything. This cannot become public." But Thomas had planned for this too. The farm's defensive systems, disguised as routine agricultural infrastructure, had been carefully designed to escalate in response to exactly these tactics. As the first heavy recovery vehicles approached, new challenges emerged. The access roads, which appeared normal, had been subtly prepared over years. Specific sections began failing under the weight of heavy equipment, not catastrophically, but enough to create immovable obstacles. Each attempted bypass led vehicles into prepared zones where they'd encounter precisely engineered difficulties. "Remarkable," Sarah breathed, watching through their surveillance. "Every piece of normal farm infrastructure is actually part of an interlocking defensive system." "Agriculture teaches you to think long-term," Thomas replied, monitoring his systems. "Every season builds on the last. Every change to the land becomes permanent if you do it right. 5 years of preparing this property, making small modifications that looked completely normal to anyone checking." Prescott's voice carried raw fury as another recovery vehicle became stuck. "This is impossible. He's turning the whole property against us without even showing himself." "Because he still thinks like a tactical commander," Thomas explained to Sarah. "He expects direct confrontation, force against force. He's not considering that every irrigation pipe, every storage tank, Every routine piece of farm equipment might have been modified for specific defensive purposes. Their sensors showed the classified technology still secured in transport trucks, now effectively trapped on the property. More news vans were arriving by the minute, drawn by the mysterious data releases and reports of unusual activity at a local farm. "Sir," one of Prescott's communications officers reported, "we're getting calls from the Capitol. Governor Harrison is demanding updates, and there's something else. FBI vehicles approaching from multiple directions." Prescott's response was immediate. "Wipe everything, destroy the cargo if we have to. Nothing can be traced back to—" His order was cut short as Thomas activated his final defensive measures. The farm's power systems, which appeared to run on normal agricultural generators, revealed sophisticated modifications. Targeted electromagnetic pulses, harmless to humans but devastating to electronic equipment, rippled across specific sections of the property. "Devices offline," teams reported in growing panic. "Demolition charges won't activate. Electronic locks frozen. We can't even open the cargo containers." Sarah's tablet showed the full effect of her father's preparations. Every piece of their equipment, every backup system, every contingency. You planned for all of it. "Because they'd expect a military response," Thomas confirmed. "Direct confrontation, tactical exchanges. Nobody considers that a farmer might spend years turning routine agricultural infrastructure into a comprehensive defensive network." Through their surveillance, they watched Prescott's operation collapse into chaos. Professional tactical teams trained for every conventional combat scenario found themselves helpless against methods they'd never considered. Their sophisticated military equipment, rendered useless by precisely applied agricultural principles, became dead weight. "FBI teams establishing perimeter," Sarah reported. Local news already broadcasting live. National outlets picking up the story. Satellite trucks setting up. Thomas allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction, which means in about 30 seconds. Right on cue, Prescott's secure phone rang. Even through their surveillance, they could hear Governor Harrison's fury. "What the hell is happening out there? My office is getting calls from federal agencies, news organizations, even foreign consulates. Sir, Walker's done something to the property. Our equipment's not working. Recovery vehicles can't get through. We can't even—" "I don't want excuses. Contain this situation before—" But it was already too late. News helicopters appeared overhead, their cameras capturing the scene of military-grade transport vehicles stranded on a local farm, surrounded by what appeared to be private tactical teams. The very professional operation that was supposed to be invisible had become impossible to hide. "You know what the governor and Rogers never understood?" Thomas asked Sarah as they watched their plans reach fruition. "Sometimes the most effective strategy isn't about winning the fight. It's about making sure the right people are watching when it happens." The farm's defensive systems continued their work, containing Prescott's teams without ever engaging them directly. Because Thomas Walker had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one that destroys your enemy, it's the one that lets them destroy themselves. News helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights illuminating a scene that would dominate national headlines by morning. FBI teams established a secure perimeter, while Prescott's private military contractors found themselves caught in a trap they still didn't fully understand. "Local stations broadcasting live," Sarah confirmed, monitoring media feeds. "National networks picking up the story. Military-style operation at local farm raises questions, and the data we released is spreading faster than they can contain it." Through their surveillance, they watched Governor Harrison's arrival, this time with federal agents rather than private security. His face showed barely controlled fury as he confronted Prescott. "One farm," Harrison raged. "One simple property acquisition. How did this turn into a media circus with federal involvement?" "Sir, Walker's done something to the entire property. Our equipment's dead, vehicles trapped, cargo containers locked down. He's turned every piece of agricultural infrastructure into some kind of—" "Into exactly what it appears to be," Thomas commented quietly to Sarah. "Normal farm equipment, modified slowly over years, because sometimes the best way to hide something is to keep it in plain sight." FBI tactical teams began moving in, their caution evident as they encountered the same challenging conditions that had stymied Prescott's men. but they were hampered less, having no heavy equipment to move or sensitive cargo to protect. "Sir," an FBI commander called out, "we're detecting unusual energy signatures from those transport vehicles. Possible classified technology. We'll need specialized teams to—" His voice trailed off as the first cargo container's electronic locks, disabled by Thomas's defensive systems, finally failed completely. The doors swung open, revealing crates marked with military prototype designations that officially didn't exist. "Operation Harvest Moon," Sarah read from her tablet as documentation continued spreading across secure networks. "Unauthorized sale of classified military technology through legitimate agricultural businesses. Over $2 billion in illegal transfers already completed." Thomas watched through their surveillance as federal agents began securing evidence. Rogers thought he was so clever, using farms as cover. Agricultural shipments draw less attention than military transport. Regular deliveries look normal. Heavy equipment doesn't raise suspicions. But he never considered someone might use that same principle against him, Sarah finished. "Everything you built into this farm's defense system looks completely normal from the outside." Their sensors showed Governor Harrison being taken into custody, his protests about executive privilege ignored as evidence of his involvement became impossible to deny. Prescott was already in handcuffs, his tactical teams disarmed and contained. "Walker," Harrison shouted, somehow maintaining his political bearing even in custody. "I know you're watching. You have no idea what you've done. The people we're working with, they won't just let this go." "He's right about that," Sarah said quietly. "The foreign buyers, the technology they've already acquired, are exactly why we let them walk into this trap," Thomas replied. "Every piece of classified tech they thought they were buying has been modified. Quantum processors with hidden backdoors, artificial intelligence systems with predetermined limitations. Rogers and Harrison were so focused on profits, they never considered why a Delta Force veteran might spend years preparing for exactly this scenario." Through their feeds, they watched FBI evidence teams discovering exactly what Thomas meant. Each crate of supposedly stolen military technology contained sophisticated tracking systems, hidden identification markers, and specialized vulnerabilities built into their core systems. "You didn't just stop their operation," Sarah realized. "You helped create a way to track everyone involved." Thomas nodded grimly. 5 years of feeding them exactly what they wanted. Every sale they made, every system they delivered, every network they built, all of it compromised from the start. Because sometimes the best way to dismantle an enemy's operation isn't to destroy it. It's to let them build it exactly how you want them to, Sarah finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. Their surveillance showed federal agents discovering more evidence with each passing minute. Documentation of every sale, every buyer, every compromised official. Rogers's entire network exposed not through dramatic raids or tactical operations, but through the patient work of a farmer who understood that sometimes the most effective strategy is the one your enemy never sees coming. "Sir," Martinez's voice came through their secure channel. "Federal task force is mobilizing. Every compromised property Rogers acquired, every distribution point they established, we're moving on all of them simultaneously. Foreign buyers are already being identified and tracked." Thomas allowed himself a small smile as he watched years of careful planning reach fruition. "Sometimes the best weapon isn't the obvious one," he told Sarah. "Sometimes it's the ability to take what your enemy thinks is their strength and turn it into their weakness." The sun began rising over their farm, its light revealing the full extent of what had happened during the night. Where Prescott's team had expected to find a simple tactical engagement, they'd encountered something their military training never prepared them for: the patient, precise planning of a man who'd learned that true victory sometimes comes not from fighting your enemy, but from letting them defeat themselves. The aftermath unfolded across multiple states as federal agents moved simultaneously on every property in Rogers's network. Each farm, supposedly converted for agricultural development, revealed similar evidence of classified technology trafficking. But Thomas and Sarah Walker watched it all from a much simpler location, their own kitchen table. "Final numbers coming in," Sarah reported, scanning secure updates from Martinez. 32 properties seized. Over $3 billion in classified technology recovered. Foreign military buyers identified in 12 countries, and every piece of tech they already received is perfectly traceable, Thomas finished, calmly pouring coffee. Rogers was so focused on profit margins, he never questioned why someone with my background would spend years developing specialized farming techniques that just happened to work perfectly for his operation. The morning news played quietly in the background, showing footage of Commissioner Rogers being led into federal custody. His agricultural development empire, built through intimidation and corrupt political connections, had crumbled overnight. Agent Martinez reports they found something interesting in Rogers's private files, Sarah continued. Surveillance reports on you going back 6 years. They'd been watching you even before you bought this farm. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. Because they thought they understood what they were seeing. Former Delta Force operator, retiring to a quiet farming life. They assumed I was burnt out, looking for peace. Never occurred to them I might have other reasons for choosing this specific property. Their secure feeds showed federal teams still processing evidence from the barn's hidden basement. Each piece of technology revealed new layers of Rogers's operation, and new proof of how thoroughly Thomas had compromised it from the start. The modified quantum processors, Sarah said, understanding dawning in her eyes. Every piece of classified tech they sold. You didn't just let them steal it, did you? You helped design the vulnerabilities they never noticed. Sometimes the best way to stop an enemy isn't to fight them directly, Thomas replied. It's to let them think they're winning while you're actually guiding every step they take. Martinez's voice came through their secure channel. Ghost, you're not going to believe what we found in Harrison's private servers. Operation Harvest Moon wasn't just about selling technology. They were building an entire shadow infrastructure. Military-grade communication networks, hidden supply lines, predetermined response protocols. All using legitimate agricultural businesses as cover, Thomas confirmed. Because who looks twice at farming equipment moving along normal shipping routes? Who questions regular deliveries between agricultural properties? But every piece of infrastructure they built, Sarah added, every system they put in place, was compromised from the start, Thomas finished. Because sometimes the most effective strategy isn't stopping your enemy from building something. It's making sure they build exactly what you want them to build. Their surveillance showed FBI teams finally managing to access the quantum processors that Rogers had thought were his greatest prize. Each system revealed sophisticated modifications that turned stolen military technology into a weapon against its own buyers. Sir, one of Martinez's technical analysts reported, these processors. The architecture is incredible. Every calculation they make, every piece of data they process, creates traceable patterns we can monitor. But it's so deeply integrated into the core design, no one would find it unless they knew exactly what to look for. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. 5 years of preparation, letting them think they were stealing valuable technology, when actually, they were helping you create a way to track and monitor everyone involved in their operation, Sarah finished, right down to the end users they were selling to. The morning sun cast long shadows across their farm as federal teams continued processing evidence. But these shadows held no more threats, no more hidden dangers. Every tool Rogers and his people had thought would protect them had been carefully designed to ensure their own exposure. Governor Harrison made one fundamental mistake, Thomas explained, watching multiple agencies coordinate their response to the emerging evidence. He thought controlling agricultural land meant controlling territory, never understood that farming isn't about control. It's about patience, preparation, and understanding how everything connects. Sarah's tablet showed new alerts as international law enforcement began moving on identified buyers. They're already tracking shipments across 3 continents. Every piece of technology Rogers sold is leading them straight to previously hidden operations. Because sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the obvious one, Thomas said quietly. Sometimes it's the ability to take what your enemy thinks is their strength and turn it into their weakness. Through their kitchen window, they could see their farm returning to normal as federal teams completed their work. The irrigation systems that had so thoroughly disrupted Prescott's tactical teams now simply watered crops. The storage tanks that had created such havoc with military equipment now held normal agricultural supplies. Because Thomas Walker had learned that sometimes the best way to hide something isn't to keep it secret. It's to make it so perfectly ordinary that no one ever thinks to look closer. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone why underestimating a quiet farmer might be the last mistake an enemy ever makes. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of Operation Harvest Moon emerged through federal investigations and international task force findings. The Walker family farm had returned to its quiet routine, though visitors now looked at the peaceful agricultural setting with new understanding. Final briefing with the Joint Chiefs complete, Martinez reported during his visit, sharing coffee at the same kitchen table where Thomas had planned his operation. The modified technology you built into their shipments, it's revolutionizing how we track illegal arms trading. Every system they sold thinking they were compromising our security actually strengthened it, Thomas finished, because sometimes the best defense isn't stopping your enemies from taking something. It's making sure what they take serves your purposes instead of theirs. Sarah brought in her laptop, displaying updates from across the country. They've identified 47 more properties involved in Rogers's network, each one set up as legitimate agricultural business, each one carefully positioned along specific transit routes. Creating an entire shadow infrastructure, Martinez added. Military-grade communication systems hidden in farm equipment. Secure transport routes disguised as routine deliveries. If you hadn't exposed it, they would have established something very dangerous, Thomas acknowledged. But they made the same mistake everyone else did. They thought farming was just about working the land, never understood it's really about understanding how everything connects. Their secure feeds showed federal teams still discovering new evidence at properties across multiple states. Each farm revealed similar patterns, legitimate agricultural operations serving as cover for sophisticated technology trafficking. But every piece of classified tech they'd moved had been compromised from the start. The quantum processors are the key, Sarah explained, pulling up technical documentation. Every calculation they make, every piece of data they process, creates patterns we can track. The buyers think they're getting advanced military technology, while actually giving us unprecedented access to their own operations, Martinez finished. Ghost, the Joint Chiefs want to know, how long were you planning this? The modifications to the technology, the way you set up your farm's defense systems. Thomas smiled slightly. Remember that mission in Kurdistan? When we learned sometimes the best way to stop an enemy supply line isn't to destroy it? Martinez's eyes widened with understanding. It's to let them build it exactly how you want them to build it. You were laying the groundwork for this even before you bought the farm. Because Rogers and Harrison thought like tactical commanders, Thomas explained. They saw military objectives, strategic positions, forces to be controlled. Never understood that farming teaches you different lessons about how to achieve your goals. Sarah's laptop showed new alerts as international teams continued tracking compromised technology. Each system Rogers had sold thinking he was weakening American security was actually strengthening it in ways his buyers would never detect. The foreign military units who thought they were gaining an advantage, Martinez said, shaking his head in amazement. Every piece of classified tech they purchased is helping us map their entire command and control structure, Thomas confirmed. Because sometimes the most effective strategy isn't about fighting your enemy. It's about letting them think they're winning while actually serving your purposes. Through their kitchen window, they could see the farm's irrigation systems working normally. The same systems that had so thoroughly disrupted Prescott's tactical teams. Every piece of agricultural infrastructure that had seemed so ordinary now stood as testament to years of patient preparation. You know what Rogers never understood? Thomas asked, watching the peaceful scene. Farming isn't about quick victories or overwhelming force. It's about preparation, patience, and understanding that everything you do has long-term consequences. Sarah's laptop pinged with new data from ongoing investigations. They're still finding hidden connections. Each property Rogers acquired, each business he set up. It's all leading to other operations we never knew existed, Because he thought like a businessman and a corrupt official, Martinez observed. Saw properties to be acquired, assets to be controlled. Never realized he was actually helping build something designed specifically to expose operations like his. Thomas nodded, satisfied with how years of careful planning had come to fruition. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy isn't through direct confrontation. Sometimes it's about understanding what they want, what they think they're achieving, and finding ways to turn those very things against them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across their farm, but these shadows held no more hidden threats, no more concealed dangers. Every tool Rogers and his people had thought would protect them had been carefully designed to ensure their own exposure. Because Thomas Walker had learned that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the obvious one. It's the ability to take what your enemy thinks is their strength and turn it into their own undoing. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone why underestimating a quiet farmer might be the last mistake an enemy ever makes. 6 months after Operation Harvest Moon's exposure, the Walker family farm hosted a different kind of gathering. Federal agents, international task force members, and intelligence officials converged not for an operation, but to acknowledge something unprecedented in modern security operations. The final numbers are almost unbelievable, Martinez addressed the small group assembled in the converted barn. 83 hostile military operations exposed, over $5 billion in classified technology recovered or tracked, and most importantly, an entire shadow infrastructure that would have compromised national security now serves to strengthen it. Thomas stood quietly at the back, more comfortable in his role as a farmer than as the center of attention. Sarah, however, continued updating the presentation with new data streaming in from ongoing operations. Every piece of technology they thought they were stealing, she explained, every system they believed would give them an advantage, has become a window into their own operations, and they still haven't realized how thoroughly they've been compromised. The Joint Chiefs Representative, General Carson, studied the agricultural equipment visible through the barn doors with new appreciation. You know what amazes me most, Walker? Not just the scale of what you accomplished, but how you did it. No direct confrontation, no obvious military action, just patience, Thomas finished. Understanding that sometimes the most effective strategy isn't about fighting your enemy. It's about letting them think they're winning while actually guiding every step they take. The farm's irrigation systems worked peacefully in the background, the same systems that had so thoroughly disrupted Prescott's tactical teams. Every piece of agricultural infrastructure that had seemed so ordinary stood as testament to a different kind of strategic thinking. We've had to completely revise our approach to security operations, Carson admitted. Your methods. They're changing how we think about long-term strategic planning. The idea that someone could turn legitimate agricultural infrastructure into such an effective defensive network. Because farming teaches you different lessons about achieving objectives, Thomas explained. It's not about quick victories or overwhelming force. It's about preparation, understanding connections, and recognizing that everything you do has long-term consequences. Sarah's presentation showed new data from international operations. The modified quantum processors continue providing unprecedented intelligence. Every system Rogers sold thinking he was compromising security actually creates traceable patterns we can monitor indefinitely. And the buyers still have no idea, Martinez added. They think they're getting advanced military technology, while actually giving us deep insight into their own operations. It's brilliant in its simplicity. Thomas moved to the barn doors, looking out over his fields. Rogers and Harrison thought controlling land meant controlling territory. Never understood that farming isn't about control. It's about working with what you have, understanding natural patterns, and sometimes letting things develop in ways that seem chaotic, but actually serve your purpose. The gathered officials watched as normal farm operations continued around them. Irrigation systems that had once disrupted military-grade equipment now simply watered crops. Storage tanks that had created such havoc with tactical teams now held ordinary agricultural supplies. You know what's most remarkable? Carson observed. Everything you built into this farm's defense system looks completely normal from the outside. No one would ever suspect. Because sometimes the best way to hide something isn't to keep it secret, Thomas replied. It's to make it so perfectly ordinary that no one ever thinks to look closer. Sarah's final slides showed the continuing impact of their operation. Rogers's network, built through intimidation and corruption, had become a tool for exposing similar operations worldwide. Each piece of compromised technology they'd sold continued revealing new connections, new threats, new opportunities for intervention,